Good afternoon. I'm not just going to let you sit here and I'm going to start now. It's past. And I would welcome you to our panel discussion about the post-COP28 debrief and whether the agreement goes far enough. My name is Benito Müller. I'm a visiting professor at the Environmental Change Institute and convener International Climate Policy Research. No one knows what that means, but it's okay. And I've been in Oxford just about 40 years, almost 30 of which I've been doing climate change. I've been going to most of the COPs, and I'm going to stop soon. But before I do that, I wanted to say a couple of things about my personal experience in Dubai. And it was a sad COP for me. Two very dear friends passed away the year beforehand. Selim ul Haq, who was the professor at the Independent University in Dhaka. We worked together for 30 years, very closely. And Pete Betts, who was the EU lead negotiator and the UK lead negotiator for many years. That was the first thing I saw when I actually arrived in the plenary. But before that, I actually went directly from here to London, to Pete's funeral, and then to Dubai, okay? So it was a bit emotional. You can see some of the dinosaurs of the process. The left is Arthur Runge-Metzger, who was the co-chair of the ADP, John Ashton, myself, and Todd Stern. To me, the thing which was most, again, almost emotional was the size of this whole thing. We did a study in 2021 when we looked at how the COPs have evolved, participation number-wise. And you can see, that one went until 2019, obviously, and that was Madrid. And every single treaty COP, Kyoto, Copenhagen, Paris, meant there was a doubling of participants afterwards as the new normal. We looked at determinants. It was not the number of agenda items and so forth. It was really the matter of PR going on. But what is worse, it's continuing, okay? I basically modified the figure, and you can see after Paris, we have Glasgow, Sharm el-Sheikh, Dubai. These are just, blue is the parties, the pink badges, orange is NGOs, and gray is press. And it gets worse. The yellow here are party overflow badges, which basically means that they started, I don't know when they started with party overflow badges, not too long ago, which party said, we don't want everyone listed in the participant list. So we need to have some spare badges which we can give without them having to be listed. There are more of them than there are actually other participants now. So we went up, these are the registered, not necessarily everyone went, but you can see it's more than 90,000 badges, registrations, compared to this. This is not sustainable. Good word, isn't it? Not going to explain. We are writing another short piece, and we're going to do a revamp of the study. But basically, our message is, what has happened is the process has grown. Some people say organically, others say cancerously, just exponentially, okay? Whenever some new idea came in, you added it on to the COP. From the climate action thing to the champions, everything. So what we now have is in essence 3 quite distinct events happening at the same time in the same place. You have the sessions of the governing bodies, which we call negotiations. You have summits, and you have the expo, as I call it. These three things are actually quite separable. There's very little interaction, and what we're proposing is to make it more sort of rational, is to literally, for example, just keep the negotiations in Bonn. You know, June, November, Bonn, 5,000 people, basta. We don't need signature outcomes. I mean, we don't need new treaties, I hope. Okay, so the point here is, Expo is not bad. I mean, we have trade fairs and they can be helpful, but what we have right now is we're basically restricting many countries from not being able to become COP presidents because they're just too small, right? So that's one thing. Now, let's go to the topic of today's debrief. Is the agreement going far enough? What agreement, I asked. Miles told me, it's the UAE consensus. I said, what? And I went to have a look. It's actually on the UFCCC website. It's a selection of decisions from the COP and the CMA, and the most important of which are the loss and damage fund and the stock take. Then you have some work programs and the youth climate champion. But these, so in essence, when I want to talk about the agreement, it is the loss and damage financing decision and the stock take. I will now say just a couple of words about the financing. We had a side event co-hosted with Antigua and Barbuda on climate solidarity levies. Basically, our view is, if we want this fund to be, well, there are two scenarios which are not good. The first one is this fund can remain a placebo fund, empty, not good. The second one, it's a siphon fund. It basically siphons off money from the other funds, also not good. So we have to realize that countries will not be able to give much more from sort of ordinary budgetary contributions, so we need to find other sources of income for this fund. And one of them is derived from an idea which I developed with Cameron Hepburn in 2006. When I told Cameron the time may have come, he said, well, every dog has its day. Maybe ours has come. Who knows? Basically, the idea is to have a small, like the French Solidarity Levy for HIV/AIDS, have a small charge, $5 per ticket, economy and so on. And you can get, I mean, the estimates is 8 to 10 billion annually, if it were everyone. But let's not go for an international agreement. Let's just have an alliance of countries who get together and do it now. Stop talking, let's do it, okay? And in that context, I had a very good outcome of this side event is someone from New York came up to me after I said it would be difficult in the US to get this through, even domestically, because it needs passing of legislation. He said to me, come to New York. Just go to the New York, New Jersey Port Authority directly. So I did a couple of number juggling. And if you were $5 per passenger and $10 per container, cargo container, 600 million annually, right? So even subnationally you can do stuff. So what I'm saying is we need to basically see the need for this fund to get funded and come up with new ideas and do it now. Now, we have a very distinguished panel which I would like to invite. Well, no, actually, we have the panelists coming up. So we have Professor Miles Allen. That'll do. All right. You can read it. You can read it. Yes. And then we have the next one in the order will be Dr. Abrar Chaudhry, Dr. Nicola Ranger, and Professor Mette Morsing. So with no further ado, oh, hold on. This is being filmed. recorded, okay? So beware. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benito. So I'm going to kick off with like Benito, taking you sort of through what COP was to me. I don't know if anybody gets a real overview of what actually happened in COP, and it's one of the mysteries about it. One of the frustrating things about it is actually trying to work out what is actually going on. And I you know, what of the many things that you're aware of happening actually matter, and which the ones are just pure fluff, and it's very, very difficult to tell. So my COP, so I can really only share with you what I saw, was dominated by the fossil phase-out debate, and it's very relevant to our conversation today because many people felt that the agreement, the UAE consensus, didn't go far enough because it didn't commit to phasing out fossil fuels. And I was dragged into this early by the second day of COP, early on in the first week. The Guardian published a big expose article in which they quoted Sultan Al Jaber, the president of COP, and the headline of the article was, "No science behind fossil phase-out, COP president." That was the headline, that was the Guardian's headline. Now, if you look at what he said, which was actually 2 weeks before the COP, and it was a verbal conversation, it wasn't a written statement from him, he said there's no science out there, or no scenario out there, that says that the phase-out of fossil fuels is what's going to achieve 1.5 degrees. And if I'd said that, which, by the way, is true, the statement, and if the Guardian had picked up on that and picked out the words "no science" when he'd obviously corrected himself to say "no scenario," which is the correct thing to say, I'd have grumbled at the Guardian. He's clearly above grumbling at the Guardian, so fair enough. But I did grumble at the time and landed into hot water on Twitter as a result. But, I think the point is, and I know there's many people in this room who felt that it was unhelpful to point out that this statement is true, but the statement is true. And I don't think it's our job, if we're going as domain specialists to COP, to, obfuscate what our own science says. And our own science says, insofar that scenarios represent science, these are the scenarios that meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. These are, I'm showing you here, the scenarios from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that limit warming to 1.5 degrees. 75% on the sort of median scenario, 75% of that is achieved by reducing the consumption of fossil fuels. And of course, the remaining 25% has to be dealt with by neutralizing the climate impact of our remaining use of fossil fuels, which persists in these scenarios, more or less constant level, all the way out to the end of the century. And that was what, and I'm sure you all know, in scenarios where we do achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, we stop the warming around mid-century. So Sultan Al Jaber is absolutely correct that the phase out of fossil fuel, which, by the way, later in the interview, he did say he saw as inevitable, eventually, is not what's going to achieve 1.5 degrees. Because what's going to achieve 1.5 degrees is a combination of reducing our use of fossil fuels and neutralizing the climate impact of the remainder. Does it matter? I believe it matters a great deal, because if we look at this figure from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, this shows the investment in different energy transition sectors. And if I just highlight the two in the middle there, hydrogen and CCS, both of them, those are the two of these various sectors, investment in renewable energy, investment in nuclear energy, storage, electrotransport. None of those are relevant to that 25% neutralizing the climate impact of our remaining use of fossil fuels. The two that are relevant are those two in the middle. Can you see them on the graphs? The answer is you can't. The CCS one is the same, it's a different color green, so it'd be quite hard for you to tell it anyway, but it would be, if you could see it, somewhere in there. Okay? So that's the point. 25% of the solution in terms of emission reductions, and zero, indistinguishable from zero, of investment. And that's because when I talk to the big fossil fuel companies and grumble about this, they say, but we're going to phase out fossil fuels apparently, so what's the point? And they have a very clear answer. So where we ended up, after this great debate about should we have phase out of fossil fuels or the alternative wording phase out of unabated fossil fuels, which of course people didn't like, but is actually what we need, we end up with a different language entirely, transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems. And just so you realize this, it's left, I'm sure, deliberately vague whether that encompasses fossil fuels in transport systems, for example. We have to hope it does. This was the language they managed to come up with. And then they also followed up with a list. This is in the stock take decision. They ended up with a list of the technologies they wanted to accelerate in order to achieve net zero by 2050. And again, net zero what by 2050 was left a little bit ambiguous. Time will tell exactly what it means. Anyway, I'm sure there's people in this room who disagree with my emphasis on the fossil phase-out discussion, so I look forward to the conversation. Thank you, Benito.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I don't have any slides, but what I really wanted to speak about today was kind of my experience at COP, really looking at the perspective of business at COP and finance at COP as well. From day one, I think the big thing that happened there was the loss and damage fund was announced. And that really heralded that this COP is a lot about business and finance. Someone who studies, as a social scientist who studies climate change and business, one of the things that I really focus on is, how do we bring different stakeholders together? How do we get businesses, private sector, NGOs, public sector coming together? And that's something we started to see at COP. A lot of people argue that, what's the objective of having this COP? Benito showed this number, of excessive number of people showing up. But there was a very nice quote by the UN climate chief who said, without these conferences, we would be headed for 5 degrees. We're currently headed for 3 degrees. So it does make a difference. But I wanted to speak about three elements that I saw at COP. One is kind of the face of the oil industry. The second thing was, was COP a trade show or a negotiation? And then finally, bringing perspective to a country level. What does it mean for developing countries? And I'll use a very narrow example of Pakistan because I was supporting the Pakistan pavilion there. But if we start with the face of oil, of course, the COP from the very beginning was controversial. You have a head of an oil company, Sultan Al Jaber, being appointed, and everyone went around and said, there is conflict of interest. How can you have an oil baron, oil chief, negotiating for, developing countries? But the question is, I've been to many, many climate conferences, and I'm sure many of you have too. And we always talk about private sector. We'll come and say, okay, private sector needs to do this, or this needs to happen. But they're faceless. They're not in the room. Who are we addressing? And I think, despite all the power challenges, all the conflict of interest, I think for the first time we were actually seeing who are we speaking to? How do we get our message across? And of course, it had lots of controversy, but there were also some positives that started to come out. Suddenly, you had someone that you could, put your grievances to. And I looked at some of the figures, and, we had a global decarbonization accelerator that was signed in. So 52 oil companies actually came together, which represent about 40% of the emissions, to actually start to talk about how they will decarbonize. Now, that's another thing, whether that's going to happen or not. But the point is, suddenly, we have someone that we can speak to, we can relate to, and we can take those conversations. So I think getting the private sector in was extremely important. And for me, that was a big take. The second side, I was fortunate, I had a Blue Zone Access Pass. And I looked at the numbers, Benito. It's like 85,000 delegates were signed up for this COP. But I think there were about 500,000 visitors that came in the green zone. So if you're at COP, there was like a barrier in the middle and you had your access and you could actually go from the blue zone to the green zone. But what was very interesting was like the first day when I was standing in the line, getting my registration, I met this woman and I started chatting with her and I asked her like, okay, what is your objective? Why are you here? So she told me that, she was a head of a very large sustainability consulting organization. And I said, okay, what's your objective? What are you going to achieve? And she said, we have like 70 events organized here. Just one organization, one private sector consulting company. And then we have meetings on the sideline with our clients. I spoke to another bank just before COP, and what they told me was that, we have 150 projects that we've signed up to showcase at COP. So what you started to see was that there was a whole plethora of startups, businesses. You go in the green zone, they have their pavilions. There were people flying in. You can argue about the carbon footprint, whether it's worth it or not. But I think what we were seeing was that there was an engagement that had started to happen. The private sector was now bringing in all these conversations. And I don't know how much of this is actually driven by the country itself. Because of course, UAE as a country that can push things forward, I think the private sector was getting more and more engaged. But our big question for businesses here is really to talk about, is this greenwashing? When businesses come to COP, they do all these panels, do all these talks, they have, hundreds of people coming in, is this greenwashing or are they doing something? And I think that's very hard to determine. I think the big question when you ask about sustainability with these businesses is really, how core are these activities? Like, will this change the business? Will this change the organization? Or is this just an add-on? So what we were seeing was signs of these conversations that are happening. Whether that particular bank will become sustainable, will be central, we don't really know. But I think those are some of the conversations we're seeing. Okay, and then finally, I wanted to come back to the country level, like Pakistan. So I'd spent a lot of time supporting them. And the big questions for countries like Pakistan is, of course, they're extremely vulnerable. We had big flooding. And it was an opportunity for countries to actually showcase their initiative, their projects. And once you were there, you could see like hundreds of these pavilions there. But what was also happening was a lot of these countries were in a silo. Like you're in the blue zone, you're actually talking to people that you already know. You bring in these multilaterals that you can actually speak to outside the COP as well. So what I didn't really see is that there weren't a lot of new relationships that were germinating. Like on one side, we had private sector that was committing billions of dollars, or at least talking about billions of dollars. But the conversation at the country level were restricted to actors that are in a closed room. And for me, that was a lost opportunity. Like, how do we bring the conversations for the private sector, for the funding, for the $85 billion that was committed at COP? How will that make it back to the country? So I guess my final kind of point is, what's going to happen post-COP? Like, how would countries start to take these conversations further? Everyone's been attracted by the billions that are being said there. But we know that it takes time for that money actually to trickle down to companies. And I think that's where the real work needs to happen. Thank you so much.
Well, hello, everyone. So maybe sort of continuing this theme of why we go to COP and what we took it out of sort of personally from it before moving on to the finance stuff, which is what I focus on in my research. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicola Ranger. I'm based in the Environmental Change Institute. I've sort of worked for about 20 years in this area, and I've attended COP as a negotiator as a government official and now as an academic. And I think actually going as an academic is the hardest in some ways, because why are we there as an academic? And I'm sort of speaking to some academics while I was there from all around the world. And actually one of the great things about COP is you do meet people from all around the world, which is wonderful. But I think you're there, I see my role there as to provide the evidence, to sort of hold to account and provide that robust evidence on the science, on the economics, and really bring that into the discussion, because there's not always a lot of evidence that's being thrown around. There's a lot of shouting at each other, lots of people lobbying, not a lot of people listening. And so it is quite a challenging environment. So I really see that researchers provide, they have to be part of that discussion and provide that role. So to get on to the things that I focus on, which is particularly around finance and resilience. So they're my two focal areas. So I'll quickly recap, what were the big things that happened and where were the gaps? So on finance, some big numbers were thrown around, right? So depending on how you count, 85 billion of new pledges made. And finance is absolutely essential for achieving this enormous structural transition that we need to address climate change. And these numbers sound huge, 85 billion, but then if you compare that to the almost 6 trillion that's needed before 2030, just for the energy transition and adaptation, we have a long way to go. And actually, so one of the pieces of research that I look at is how do we make the whole financial sector actually work for this transition? And one of the frustrations I always feel in these discussions is we talk about these big numbers, but then we forget that actually the whole financial system is trillions. We need to get every penny of that 90 trillion globally running in the same direction. And to do that, we need every financial institution, we need every central bank, every regulator to be bought into this as well. And that's what I do in a lot of my research, all the data, all the methodologies around how to do that. And certainly one of the results of the global stock take, so finance was very recognized in there and recognized this huge gap, but this recognition of the limited progress on this alignment of the global financial system. So a lot of good things have happened since COP26, for example, in the UK. So we have new standards bodies set up. We have organizations like the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, doing more stress testing in financial institutions. We have all these pledges, but actually, we're not really mobilizing the full force of the financial sector. And certainly, and that's not just about private finance. If you look at the public finance, 1.3 trillion still going into fossil fuel subsidies every year. One of my heroes, Kristina Georgieva, who's the head of the IMF, said finance or capital is like a river. It doesn't go to where the obstacles are, it sort of flows downhill to where the returns are. And when you keep pumping subsidies in from the public sector, the private finance flows towards it. So unless we correct that issue, we're in a lot of trouble. So that's what I'll say on the finance side. On adaptation, which is another focus for me, there was progress as well, but still the huge financing gap. But the real, and we wrote a paper recently called The Green Scorpion. The green scorpion in the room is nature at this COP. And there, I think we made big progress. So nature was firmly on the agenda. And why do we care about nature when we're talking about climate change? For many reasons. For example, if we do not stop deforestation, we will not reach 1.5 degrees. We will not achieve that goal. If we do not protect our natural capital around the world, we will not be able to adapt to the changes that we see in climate. This is fundamentally underpinning of our society. So, and a key recognition at this COP was that integration between climate and nature, and a recognition, including within the global stocktake, that these two things need to be considered together. So that was a really positive step. But coming back to the finance side, even on nature, UNEP put out a report around COP showing that 7 trillion a year of subsidies is going to and finance is going to actually destroy nature. So, we're at COP, I think we mobilized, in the hundreds of billions support for nature, but that is being hugely undermined by these damaging environmental subsidies. So, a lot of my focus is, how do we really bring both climate and nature together into thinking in government, in ministries of finance, and in the private financial sector as well. And we have the tools to do this. And I think that to maybe perhaps sort of end on another positive, I think one great thing that we've seen from COP26 to COP28, I sat out COP27, so COP26 was the big pledges COP, wasn't it? So, finance came in on a sort of riding in on a big white horse, GFANZ with its 130 trillion that it was going to commit. Since then, we've got real. And we've said, okay, that's your pledge. Where is your transition plan to achieve that? Where are your disclosures? How are you being held to account? And I think that's huge progress. And it's been a difficult couple of years on finance, but I think now, on finance, we can go in with our heads held high and say, actually, we have those frameworks in place or coming into place. There's still a lot of work to go, but certainly things are improving. And I think that if I could make a final point before Benito kicks me off is we're always focused on, when we talk a lot about finance, we imagine that this is going to developing countries. A lot of this that we're talking about finance is just circulating within high-income countries. It needs to be supporting emerging and developing economies. And that's where we're not really doing enough either. We're not really looking at how do we build the frameworks to enable developing countries to benefit from these huge financial flows as well. Again, that's another key focus of the research that we're doing here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I was attending COP also with the team here in December, and I will say, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mette Morsing, and I'm the director of the Smith School here at Oxford. And I will say I really enjoyed meeting the strangers in the sense that everybody comes to the COP, of course, to discuss the climate. But here you meet the stranger from different disciplines, from different sectors, from different geographies that you don't meet normally because you simply run into them, because you simply participate in their panels, their discussions, their sessions. So I really thought it was an immense richness of conversations that is difficult to orchestrate on an everyday basis as a university professor. And I want to focus on the role of the university at COP. And Nicola, I think you sort of alluded a little bit to our roles as researchers participating in the COP. I think that it's very important to think about those about 50 of us from University of Oxford participating in the COP, how we bring the university into COP, but also how we bring COP into the university. Because it's not just what happens, of course, during those days that we participate in the huge event that COP is every year. It is also how we prepare before we go, how we coordinate, how we discuss, how we maybe want to launch some things as we get there. We prepare and we go and we have the wonderful conversations that inspire us. And then, of course, we come back home. And in that coming back home, we are also taking the COP discussions with us. First and foremost, I want to say how we bring them back to our students. And our students are asking for this big time, I would say. The students are really asking us to put more focus on how we engage and how they will engage with the climate as they graduate from our institutions. And here I'm not just talking about University of Oxford, of course. I spent, before I came here, about 4 months ago, I spent almost 4 years working for the United Nations and heading up their largest initiatives on business schools and the Sustainable Development Goals. And one thing that was clear at COP this year and starting off at the 26th COP was the focus on finance, as Nicola has already said. And I can just tell you that if you look upon the finance curriculum across the world, and I have, climate is a side event. It's an additional thing that may happen on the session 14, just before we close off, before examination. And by the way, we don't have time because we need to do other things before the exam. It's not in the curriculum. And of course, when it's not in the curriculum at our schools, at our universities, then you can also see why it takes so long, for the financial sector, all those experts who were not trained, whom we did not train, to actually engage in those streams and those rivers that you talked about before, Nicola. So I really think that COP sort of brings a responsibility back to us as educators for our students, and our students, as I said, they're asking for it. I think it is the fingers need to be pointed to ourselves as educators. And we know, according to UNESCO, that we educate about globally 220 million young people every year. 220 million, it's not every 10 years, every year we send out into practice. Whether that practice is business, that's about 1/3 of them, or whether it's about any other kind of sciences, we need to think about how we put more climate knowledge and more climate skill set into this curriculum and into the pedagogies that we bring. Last evening, I was fortunate to be invited to the Oxford Impact Lab, and here we have 70 students who were eager to discuss the COP28 and wanting to do something, wanting to bring that into their practices when they graduate very soon. So a lot of things are happening here at Oxford University on that side, I'm happy to say. And I do believe that the 50 of us traveled there, we are part of bringing that into the classroom. The other thing is, of course, the research that inspires us before we go, as we are there, and as we bring more knowledge back home. And definitely the evidence that researchers bring is key to the conversations and to keep the conversations at the level needed at COP. But I think there's also another aspect, and that's the other agendas that I can see we are bringing in to COP. For example, nature. As you also mentioned before, Nicolai, the nature, and we know that here at the University of Oxford, we have a huge group of people working on nature-based solutions. And I think that the inspiration we bring with our focus, our professors, orchestrating a number of sessions, panels, discussions, debates, disagreements, of course, matters because they will be disseminated. They would be read in the newspapers and by politicians also, of course, because we also bring them into the panels and participating in those dialogues. So I think the climate as one, we saw this year health. The first time the COP now has a dedicated day for health is also an issue where our experts, our scholars bring in knowledge, evidence to stimulate that debate. And inequality, I think was a huge thing that I really followed a lot this year. And inequality, of course, to do with the low-income, disadvantaged countries and the finance needed there, but also indigenous people First Nation people were very present, bringing in new knowledges as well. And of course, then there is the ever-ongoing gender debate, gender inequality. And I was just looking at the statistics that, Benito, you didn't show the statistics about how many women were in the beginning, and I can tell you there was 12%. In the beginning until today, over 30 years, we have almost a balanced gender participation. So that's good. The only thing is I also noted that next year, Azerbaijan, we have 28 persons leading the committee, and guess what gender they all have. So there's still some work to be done. There's still a need for a debate about that kind of inequality as well next year. My final note will just be that there is a lot of criticism about COP and other events like this, but about COP it's only about talk. It's nothing but talk, and there's a lot of greenwashing, there's a lot of hot air, etc. But let me just remind you, if we look upon James Austin, a philosopher, linguist philosopher, and his famous book about how to make action out of words and the performativity of talk. I mean, we talk a lot here at universities, by the way, also. And talk matters. Talk is performative in itself. Just think about the apology. It's nothing but talk. The excuse, the congratulation, even the little yes in the church. After that excuse, apology, talk, the whole situation between people changes. So I do think that all the talk at COP matters a lot, and I can tell that it certainly mattered for those of us who participated in the dialogue, and it will also. So that's the good news about talk at COP. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could I ask the panel members to join us on the podium? And I think we can actually just go directly to the questions from the audience. Hold on, so, oh my God, 1, 2, 3. Wait until you, just let's do 3, and then otherwise I forget.
Hi, it's quite clear that some of the targets, like 1.5C and 2C, are not going to be met, because mitigation is not working, from everything you said. So isn't it time that the policy focus should now shift to adaptation and make societies more resilient to any future impacts of climate change?
Is that to anyone in particular? Or?
Everyone.
A second question.
We were looking the other way, Benito, if you could just repoint the people out to us.
Okay, raise the ones who I pointed out, please raise your hands. I don't remember also, so there's another one there, yes, and then number 3 there, okay? Please. And if you introduce yourself, maybe.
I'm John Cole, a physicist, retired from Clarendon Laboratory, amongst other things. Very interesting about finance. It's obvious that for things to happen, it needs an awful lot of money. Obviously, subsidies are important, but there's a limit on how much can come from governments. There's 2 other drivers for finance, one of which is carbon pricing, and the other is carbon taxation. And I think there's a limit to how much those can be done by individual countries in isolation. I'd be very interested to hear how much prospect there is on an international level.
And number 3 was back there somewhere?
Yeah, hi, I'm George I'm a research assistant at the Smith School. The UAE said at COP that they have the cleanest fossil fuels in the world. And then I got home and the UK said they had the cleanest fossil fuels in the world. And then I'm sure my colleague from Norway went home and heard the same thing from her government. That's a problem. I think everyone wants to be the last oil producer. So how can there be more accountability around that?
Right, just take the mic.
I was going to say something about the should we stop mitigation one, actually, and just focus on adaptation, and I can come on to finance. So I'll focus on the should we shift to more adaptation. Maybe I'll let Miles say should we stop mitigation. But frankly, no, we should not stop trying to reduce emissions. I'll let Miles say something about feasibility of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. But certainly, if we take into effect that the temperature change that we will see and the impacts are locked in for a period of time. So if we don't continue to reduce those emissions, we will continue to see warming. So we have to keep focused on mitigation. And I will let Miles add on to that. But then on adaptation, I very much agree with you that we need a much greater focus on adapting to climate change, and often I hear quite an unhelpful narrative that even from senior policymakers, that adaptation is seen as a failure of mitigation, and almost a fear to talk about adaptation because it's seen that, if you're focusing on adaptation, then we must have failed on mitigation, which is false, totally false. And so I think we do need a much more balanced narrative between adaptation and mitigation, and recognition that we need to do both, and we need to do both with significantly more urgency than we're doing now.
Just wanted to build one element on the adaptation side of it. I think there's an inherent element of equity in it as well. So again, using the example of Pakistan, because I was just building their case, their emissions is less than 1%. And I think that's the figure that they keep quoting again and again. And I'm sure many other countries have similar numbers that are emerging and developing. So the question is, for them, yes, mitigation is important because that's the pathway that we can see. But what about now? We had floods, many countries are having floods, so $30 billion, where will that money come from? And I think that's where this whole debate of adaptation comes in, like, where will this money go towards and which countries will benefit from it? So I think that's a bigger question that we're seeing. We have a loss and damage fund that's been capitalized with $750 million. Okay, that's great, that's a great start, but who will receive that money? Where should that be allocated? And I think that's where the big debate on adaptation is happening.
I mean, on the feasibility question, I mean, it's important to keep, as I spent a lot of time at COP, reminding people, if we could stop fossil fuels from causing global warming within a generation, we would meet the Paris Agreement goals. We would keep warming well below 2 degrees and pretty close to 1.5 degrees. So that's perfectly possible. And the reason it's possible is the aggregate profits of the fossil fuel industry, including royalties last year, would have been enough to capture every single molecule of carbon dioxide it generates and stick it back underground, so the fuels they sold would not have caused global warming. So global warming is a choice. The money is going on profits and royalties and supporting our health system, because of course a lot of it goes to the British Treasury, not on solving the problem. So, these are the kind of things I was trying to say whenever I got a hold of a microphone at COP. When it comes to the really interesting point about who's got the cleanest fossil fuels, of course you can sort of sneer at these claims at the moment. But in the end, I firmly believe we're going to solve this problem by the industry competing with itself to deliver climate-neutral fuels or go out of business. Unfortunately, they don't quite at the moment think the second part of that threat is real. They think they can carry on selling dirty fuels forever. Or they can carry on selling dirty fuels, which is much more profitable than selling clean fuels. And by clean fuels, I mean fuels in which even the use of the fuel does not result in CO2 ending up in the atmosphere. They are able to shelter behind the fact that lots of governments are saying, we're just going to stop using fossil fuels. This is an issue here in the UK. The whole debate over licensing in the North Sea is painted in black and white. Either you license new fuels and it's not a problem, or you ban it, because that's the only way. What we need to have is an argument for is, if you're going to license new extraction, what are the conditions you're going to impose on the extractors to make sure the carbon they dig up does not end up in the atmosphere? Nobody's having that conversation. That's what's missing. But hopefully, we'll start, eventually, conversations at COP will have to turn to how do we fix fossil fuels rather than how do we ban them. And that's the point where we'll start to solve the problem. And I think we have made quite a lot of progress. Let's face it, we only mentioned fossil fuels in Glasgow. And now we've got a commitment to transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems. It's not enough, but it's progress. It's hard to argue it's not progress.
It's interesting that when the whole process started, adaptation was actually seen by the sort of environmental community as a bad thing, because the fossil fuel industry said, we don't need to mitigate, we just adapt. And it was only in New Delhi COP, the adaptation COP, when it became okay to talk about adaptation. Adaptation and mitigation are of the same nature. They reduce future impacts. We have lost that game too, to some extent. That's why we talk about loss and damage. What do we do if the manure hits the fan, okay? So we cannot just say, well, okay, we do this or that. We have to do everything, I'm afraid. In terms of finance, what we need to do is to stop just thinking we can just go for government budgetary contributions. We need to, private sector, we need to mobilize everything. Okay, the big picture, but a small picture, just get new sources and get them now. Let's not talk for 20 years and then have the perfect system. So we have a question from the
I have two online, if that's okay. Jill has said, why introduce a climate levy rather than a carbon tax? Should the polluters pay for the loss and damage? And then Alicia has said, what are some of the ways in which developed countries can finance developing countries to meet global sustainable goals?
Oh dear. I come back to I'm not quite sure about climate levy and I mean, the point is, yes, polluter pays, but polluter pays is not just rich countries. We have to get away from just thinking of countries. For example, with this airline levy, you know, a subsistence farmer in Bihar typically will not fly intercontinentally, okay? So you there already have capability involved. People who fly first class can actually afford $10, right? Things like that. So we have to get away from the dogmas and just try to collect. How can you make sure that money comes to developing countries? And maybe Nicola can say something about that one.
Sure. So, well, I think the key, so many ways, but I think the key point is that we can't close the gap in finance that's needed just through public finance. So if you look now, so the Green Climate Fund received a new pledge, 12.8 billion. Again, it sounds like a big number, but actually, and it's really essential, but it's still a drop in the ocean compared to the almost 6 trillion needed for this transition and adaptation. And so we can't do that through public finance alone. It will need to be private finance. And, you know, coming back to the question on sort of linking back to the pricing point, there's a whole range of mechanisms that we need to do that. But I think one of the, including carbon pricing, including trading systems, including investing more in innovation, etc. But I think the key thing is that we need to, you know, there are a number of bottlenecks that are stopping finance flowing into developing countries at the moment. And in some ways, we can throw as much private finance as we want, but until we remove those blockages, it's not going to get to where it needs to go. And so there are a whole range of things that are needed to do that, more than we have time to discuss here. But, you know, there's a whole other agenda, the sort of Mia Motley's work on the Bridgetown agenda, for example, transforming the whole global financial system, including dealing with debt issues in developing countries, looking at things like more guarantees, credit enhancement. So there's a whole other discussion on this which sort of sits slightly outside of the COP, which is important. But I think a key point for the negotiations is that a starting point is we do need many actions by the high-income countries, including grants for things like guarantees, but also supporting developing countries through sort of technical assistance, helping them remove these barriers, sort of risk premium barriers that they have to receiving finance. There's a lot of things that need to happen, and it needs to happen very, very quickly.
Just a quick one on this levy tax question. A macro trend, as I see it, in climate at the moment, which is something I think universities should really be engaging with, is a transition towards essentially pay to pollute. The introduction of loss and damage, the introduction of ideas like just, pay for compensation for adaptation to people. We have to recognize that the value of dumping carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is so high that it would almost certainly be worth people continuing to do it and just pay whatever compensation is requested than actually to change and stop dumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So I think we need to be really careful about calls for, we're going to solve this with a levy, or we're going to solve this with a carbon tax, we're going to solve this with loss and damage, making sure that we need all these things to happen, but we also need to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming. It's not an either or. And we have to be very careful because there's very limited bandwidth at COP. And you can spend an awful lot of time talking about things that are not quite relevant to the main point.
Okay, one right there. Yes. And then the second one, the other lady. And then let's just take these two. Then, yeah, too many.
Thanks so much. My name is Alexis McGivern. I'm a fellow at Oxford Net Zero. I have a question about the ethical responsibility of academics in highly politicized spaces like COP. There was obviously a very vocal, very coordinated climate justice movement calling for fossil fuel phase out for reasons beyond carbon in the atmosphere, for the health implication, biodiversity implications, human rights implications. And when we distill it down to 1 ton in, 1 ton out, and we remove the people from the equation, and we just reflect the science as it is and remove sort of the political element of it, that can be really twisted in conferences such as COP. So I would like to hear, academics obviously reflect the world as it is, but also impact the world, and in spaces that move quickly like COP. I'd like to hear each of you speak kind of on the ethical responsibilities of academics engaging in these kind of conferences.
And the second one?
Hi, my name is Fikaya. I'm a DPhil candidate at the School of Politics and International Relations, and my research looks at climate policy and perception in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think I come to these conversations, this was my third COP, and I come to these conversations and oftentimes there's no sort of African in the room and it's just immediately a red flag. But what the data is showing from the research I'm doing and the research I'm doing with other colleagues is every time COP happens in a place like Dubai or a place like Egypt, where visa restrictions for Africans are not as bad, you find there's an uptick in African participation and there's an uptick in African perception. So what the data shows from COP28 is there was a lot of African participation because the UAE went out of its way to make sure that applying for a visa, was easy. And so my question, to not go down sort of a ramble, is to what extent are you accounting for this participation issue when you have these conversations, right? Because if we're talking about financing, we're talking about people coming to COP, we have to account for the fact that COP in the UK is not always accessible to African participants in this context. So, yeah.
Yes, to the question about the ethical responsibility of the university or at for example at COP, I think that it is very important to sort of also engage in the political debate and also have our friends in political science engage with us in the broad way of thinking about and looking upon what is actually happening around the climate agenda. We can see, again, I was living in the United States for the past 4 years, and we can see the very, very strong anti-ESG or anti-SDG movement. It's very contested, it's very politicized, and it's sort of dividing the country into two, basically, the Democrats and the Republicans, to put it in a rough sense. So nobody's really sort of discussing that part, you could sort of say, to an extent at COP, because we are very technical. And I think that kind of debate is something that is in the rooms, and it is certainly sensed when you participate in the panels, but I did not see that as a particular issue to be discussed. I think this is something that I'm very happy to know that we are engaging in those discussions at the Smith School to try to be better at understanding how do we actually make sure that our politicians dare to make those bold decisions that are needed to achieve the kind of reduction of the emissions that are needed and that whatever comes with it. I think that's a very, very next agenda. It's going to be very high on the agenda, I think, for a lot of the research that we will also do in this area in the future, because that is a real threat to the advancement that we're talking about on this panel here.
So happy to add in to that question on where do people sit, where do communities sit within the negotiation? I think that's a really, really important question, because often we do overlook that. Because a lot of times it's all about finance, it's about technical solutions, it's about finding that silver bullet where, this is how things will solve. And I guess the big question, having spent some time at the pavilion, at the country pavilion, was asking this question of who are the communities that are we serving for? Like, all these solutions, all these discussions, how will this actually meet the ground? Because, when you look at climate, yes, climate is there, but actually when you start to look at what the impacts of climate is, when it starts to meet the population, the people, or the planet, it has to kind of touch something. And I think those are the questions that it's a good reminder, because often that is lost in many of those discussions. But I think at the country level, that's where it's owned. That's where those discussions do happen, because it is in the country's agenda to look at their population. And sometimes, as I said, in our conversation, that is sometimes siloed, because I think there's so much opportunity for countries to learn from each other as well. So maybe there is a design element of how COP is built, where you get to talk to other countries more often. I think that wasn't happening a lot, but yes, absolutely.
Okay, so we have it in the front now, we had one there, and then... Yeah, and then one over here.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Pedro Moura Costa. I'm a director of, well, I've been involved in climate in many different guises, including being a director with Benito in Oxford Climate Policy and a company called EcoSecurities. Just a quick question to you, Nicola. And everybody here is talking about mobilization of additional finance, and we get really excited with 850 million in the adaptation, the loss and damage fund and so on, but it's a different order of magnitude. You just mentioned the need for 6 trillion for adaptation alone. So it is virtually impossible to mobilize at that scale, but it's very possible to discontinue the current subsidies for agriculture or the other $6 trillion of subsidies for fossil fuels. So over to you to think of how feasible this is.
Sorry. Okay, I have a question for like all the panelists. I really appreciate like the different perspective you guys give on the different roles that you guys attended under the COP. And as someone who has attended COP and tracking COP since Paris, I have noticed that COP, has changed to be more, it has more attention, it has more like, all these trade shows and everything. But I think one thing that we forget about is that COP is like a process and not a one-time event. So I think like, noticing that there's more like diversity in participants and participation, right? My question to all the panelists and the moderator is that, what's your thoughts on the transparency and also the accountability of this process have evolved into, and how can it, how will it look like actually?
Well, maybe I just say something to the second question. I think given that we're dealing, as I said before, with essentially 3 quite different processes, we need to see what are we talking about. Transparency in the negotiations is one thing. Transparency in an expo, I don't even know what that means, to be honest. Transparency in the summits, so we need to focus what transparency. The simplest is the transparency in the multilateral process, right? But it's also the smallest amount of people involved in this thing. So in that context, I think we have a process which is really quite transparent. We also have a process which is inclusive because the multilateral regime actually pays for a number of people from each country to attend. Right, so you already have a sort of a number of people who are there. Okay, some delegations have many more, but the minimal, there's some sort of inclusiveness there, and I think the process, the biggest problem which I see the process faces right now is we are meant to be implementing. We are not actually negotiating a new treaty, but with the process being in the context of these monster expos, the expectation globally of the outcome of the negotiations is way inflated. I mean, the global stocktake decision is interesting, but it's not actually corresponding to 2 or 3 times the Paris Agreement, Paris COP. So, but people actually equate the size of the conference with what should come out. And we are not doing any favors to the process by having it in conjunction.
Can I disagree with that a little bit?
Of course.
Pick up on these questions. I mean, would we have got a consensus decision that we're going to transition away from fossil fuels without this process? I don't think so, certainly not by now. And the question really is, will that decision have any impact on people's investments going forward? And the fact that all these private companies were there lobbying so enthusiastically over the wording of the decision suggests that it might. The time will tell. But I think, I'm not sure I ended up agreeing with, I think I arrived at this COP firmly agreeing with you that it was out of control. I left thinking, well, this is a big issue. If the scale of the climate problem is as big as we say it is, maybe it makes sense for 100,000 people to gather together once a year to try and work out what to do about it. I mean, I know it's expensive, but compare that to the trillions that climate change is actually going to cost. And, you know, the important thing is to make sure that the COP process delivers, not worry about, you know, whether it's particularly efficient, is my view. Anyway, but that wasn't a question, that was just a reaction, okay? I did want to take an opportunity to answer Alexis' question, because I felt I sort of kind of was poking that one a little bit in my opening remarks. And, you know, my job is here in Oxford is to sort of make, you know, push people, and I feel that is part of my job. My job going to COPs, I think is also, I was really interested in your comments, Meta, about, you know, what is the role of an academic at COP, and I did spend a lot of this COP worrying about it. When Sultan Al Jaber made those remarks and the Guardian article came out, all of the comments I saw from academics were essentially agreeing with the Guardian and saying Sultan Al Jaber had got it wrong, and that it was outrageous that the president of COP should be so anti-science, on the basis of a statement that, as I read it, was correct. And in fact, I passed it by various people. And by the way, he further down in the interview, in fact, I think in the next sentence of his comments, but buried right at the end of the Guardian's article, he acknowledged that one day we would transition away from fossil fuels. So, you know, it was all there. It was misreported originally, and lots of academics joined in to pile on because they felt it was helpful to the fossil phase-out narrative. And there was a great big letter we were all asked to sign in the middle weekend of the COP, again, calling for fossil phase-out. I can understand, fossil fuels are doing great harm in the world. There's no question about that. They're also doing a lot of good in the world. I don't, you know, you say something like that and people immediately bristle and say, which oil companies paid for your ticket to come to COP? No oil company paid for my ticket to go to COP. But you know, the COP is for everyone, including the Iowa primary voter. And I think, you know, we have to remember that as academics going to COP, the audience you're speaking to at COP is massively selected to be heavily engaged in the climate issue. There's an awful lot of people out there who are depending on the COP process to get us to an equitable solution for the world, who are not nearly so engaged and may have a very different view from the average view of the people sitting in Dubai. And so as academics, it's not our job to sort of, well, some of us, of course, the social scientists, you know, working out what different constituencies have to say, that's what they do. But as a physical scientist, you know, my job is to say what our experiments, our data, our simulations tell us. I guess I do have a choice about whether to shut up. And that is an issue. Should I have just kept quiet about what I felt was a general misrepresentation of what Sultan Al Jaber's remarks meant? But when something, I think sometimes keeping quiet is itself misleading, because if none of us had said anything, you know, the message sent to the presidency is basically the Western, and there were mostly Western voices speaking, that the Western climate academic establishment is just sort of basically out to get you, because even if you say something accurate, they're going to jump on you anyway. Thanks. You know, there you are. That was what was going through my head.
We only have 2 more minutes left, and we have some questions from the internet.
So I have 2 quick questions from the internet. One is, Ian Cave asks, the IPCC negotiators say that at each COP, national ambitions increase, and so in time we will achieve 2 degrees. But Climate Action Tracker says little improvement has happened in the last year or so. What do the panel think? And finally, Chris Dye asks, how do you perceive the growing role in the debate of climate and health, which is also linked to nature?
Okay.
I can answer very briefly on the 2-degree one.
All right.
I don't have to talk too much, but I'll be very brief. So on 2 degrees, we've got pledges, it's very important people to understand this, pledges in place may limit warming this century to 2 degrees. There's possibly a reasonable chance of that, but don't forget, they don't actually stop the warming. Nobody has actually produced a path in actual policy that will stop fossil fuels from causing global warming. So we're a long way off that target. There's a huge difference between limiting warming by 2100 to 2 degrees and have the world still warming then, so we get to 3 degrees sort of sometime in 2050. You know, that might make us feel a bit better in our lifetimes, but it doesn't actually solve the problem from actually stopping global warming. We're getting there, but we're a long way to go.
Health?
Yeah, just a comment on health, just to, I don't think that I got the question completely right. It was about how much does health take up at the COP, besides again, as I said before, it's the first time in the history of COP that actually a full day was dedicated to health.
That will do.
Okay, then I want to say one more thing, and that is one of the most downloaded and most cited UN reports that came out of University of Oxford was Radhika Khosla's work and her research on cooling, and part of that, of course, being about health, just to accentuate the big interest from this kind of agenda, and in particular, of course, from this university. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, no, sorry.
No, just wanted to add one, maybe it's going in a slightly different direction, but I think this whole debate about emission reduction, I think, again, we have to think from a perspective of emerging and developing economies as well. Because I think sometimes that conversation is missed out, that, what are the pathways that they can take? Because a lot of development needs to happen in those countries. So I think there's also an opportunity, although there's pressure for, these countries that are growing to show their NDCs, what are their commitments. But I think they're at that point not realistic, because I think that growth hasn't really happened. So I think that engagement also needs to happen, that how do we ensure that these new pathways don't follow the pathways that other countries have done. So that's something that we need to bring back as well.
Any final comments from the panel?
I'll make two, if I may. So one is to come back on the point on subsidies, which we skipped over, and maybe I'll make an unpopular comment as well, is that actually sometimes there are reasons for these subsidies, and they're often, some of them are around lobbying from evil fossil fuel companies, but some of them are actually about protecting people's access to energy, people's access to food, and we saw, obviously, during the Ukraine crisis, you saw a big increase in use of subsidies to enable people to access heat for their homes. So you do, there are reasons for subsidies, but how you design the subsidy and ensuring not using subsidies where they are harmful and there isn't, a rationale from a social protection perspective. And I think the only way you can address that is country by country, looking in detail at those subsidies and looking at how you could potentially replace them with other forms of support, social protection systems that might get through those. And the second point I wanted to make is back to the emerging and developing economies and the participation point. So I engage in a number of fora, not just COP, but also annual meetings of the IMF and others. And I had a very great experience in Marrakesh for the annual meetings, where I had the pleasure, actually supported by the Oxford Martin School, of presenting to 14 ministers of finance and central bank governors from Africa. And it was very interesting hearing their perspective on what they wanted out of this, and their frustration that, hang on, all of this money is going to the high emitting countries and the high emitting developing countries, but none of it's coming to many African countries that actually desperately need this financing for adaptation, for protecting biodiversity, and to support them to take a green path to development. So I think it's absolutely crucial that those voices are much more heard, because certainly when you're in many rooms in COP, there are not people from many African nations there, for example, that are making these really critical points.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming. And I would like to invite you to thank our panelists.